August 7th, 1942. Island of Solomons, Guadalcanal. As dawn came over the Pacific, in what would be the first major Allied offensive against the Kingdom of Japan, Operation Watchtower changed the course of the Pacific War. But besides the following naval battles and battles in the jungle, an unexpected weapon appeared in the dense darkness of the islands. The Edge, one that wasn't built on steel or explosives, but on the basic structure of the language we use. The challenge came right away and was deadly. Really, in the chaos of jungle warfare, where it was impossible to see more than a few feet ahead, where the enemy spoke English and sometimes wore American uniforms that they had stolen. How could sentries at checkpoints tell the difference between friendly forces and Japanese trainers trying to get in American lines in the dark? The answer came from a strange place. The sound of one letter being said. Master Sergeant James W. Herbert, who is a combat reporter for the U.S. Marine Corps Reserve, arrived on August 7th with the assault forces. In a talk on March 10th, 1943, Herbert gave direct testimony about the security measure that became standard, which was kept in naval records. Workout during the campaign. His words are the clearest first-hand evidence we have about tests of pronunciation in the Pacific Theater. Our passwords always had the letter L in them. Robert. It was thought that L would be hard for Japanese people to say because they don't have a L sound. Word list. This seemingly simple observation showed a deep understanding of linguistic limitations that would be very important for keeping Americans safe during the campaign. Bert drew one important limitation that showed how it could be used in the real world. English-taught people sometimes failed the test. Japanese soldiers, which meant that Marines were meeting infiltrators whose English skills varied skill level and that the test, while useful, wasn't completely accurate. By 1600 hours, or 4 p.m. on August 8th, Marines had taken over the nearly finished the Japanese airfield. The airstrip, which the Japanese originally called Lunga Airfield, was changed its name to. It was named Henderson Field after Marine pilot Major Lofton R. Henderson, who was killed at the Battle of Midway. When the first PBY took off, the airfield was ready for use. The Catalina flying boat touched down on August 12th, and by August 20th, the permanent. A group of 31 planes from the air arrived. This airfield was taken over by the Japanese forces tried many times to take it back during the 6-month campaign, making it the center of attention. It became very important to keep Henderson Field and the defensive perimeter safe. Japanese forces putting on the during the Pacific War, their operations were marked by tactical flexibility and determination. Several operations of infiltration. At night, they moved through the jungle, sometimes alone and sometimes with small groups. Each one was trying to get information, damage equipment, or throw American forces off track. It was nighttime. The environment made it easy for infiltration to happen. Hundreds of years posted at checkpoints around. People on the perimeter had to decide in an instant whether people coming towards them were friendly Marines or enemy soldiers. Sneaky people. The usual ways of identifying people didn't work in these situations. It is possible to steal or fake documents. People who were hurt could have their uniforms taken. It was hard to tell what the person looked like in the dark. Even sounds could be, which was misleading because some Japanese soldiers spoke English pretty well. It was important for the Marines to have a way to prove identity that couldn't be easily copied. Traits or traits. The person who infiltrated could not consciously control. The answer lay in taking advantage of how the sounds in Japanese are put together. To figure out why this method worked, because they work so well, we need to look at the main differences between the English and Japanese sound systems. From Japan, possesses one liquid phone, which is written in standard heat burn as R, but spoken a way that is very different from the English R or L sound. This Japanese liquid is called an echo-alveolar tap in terms of language. R is written in the International Phonetic Alphabet. This is made by native Japanese speakers. To make a sound, tap the tongue quickly against the alveolar ridge, the space right behind the front upper teeth. English by. There are two clear liquid forms in contrast. This is how the English L sound looks. This sound is made by pressing the tip of the tongue firmly against the alveolar ridge and letting air flow around it. The tongue's sides. The R sound in American English is quite not the same. Usually made as a postal viola, with the tongue pulled back so it doesn't touch the roof of the mouth at all. These two English sounds are in very different places in the. Native English speakers can easily tell the difference between these sounds, but they all fall into the same perceptual category for Japanese people. This difference in appearance is not caused by physical limitations or hearing loss. With the right training, Japanese speakers can make both of these English sounds physically, and they can also hear the differences between them when the sounds are played by themselves. The problem is how people see things. Very clear-cut. The Japanese language handles both English sounds through a single set of phonetic rules. During the early years of learning a language, when people who speak Japanese hear English R, as well as the L and M sounds in real speech, their brains automatically put both the sounds of the single Japanese liquid phone. This effect was confirmed by studies done during and after World War II. Looks at Goodall in 1971, Miyake and Friends in 1975, and Takagi and Mann in 1979. In 1995 found that Japanese speakers still had trouble telling the difference between R and L in English. More time spent with English. Takagi and Mann found that people who spoke Japanese had, even after living in the US for more than 12 years, still had a lot more trouble telling the difference between R and L sounds. Not as many native English speakers. Something was found in the 1975 Milwaukee study, especially useful for the wartime application. When researchers changed recordings, Japanese speakers changed the R and L sounds to make them sound less like speech by taking away some acoustic information. Could tell them apart just as well as native English speakers. This showed that the problem wasn't with hearing not in the sounds themselves, but in how the brain translated those differences into language sounds. To keep the military safe. For our purposes, this linguistic fact meant that Japanese soldiers trying to sneak in had a nearly an insurmountable problem. Even soldiers who had studied English a lot, people who could hold a conversation in English and know a lot of words and grammar would lie through how to pronounce words that have L sounds. The way it was said was not controlled by thought. When people are tired, stressed, or pressed for time, their automatic native language pronunciation patterns would come out no matter what the infiltrator planned or how well they were prepared. How well this method works depends on how people learn language when they are young, when their brains are still developing. Helps you form mental groups for native language sounds that stay remarkably stable throughout your life. Refuse to change, even after a lot of adult training. The Marines carried out this information by giving them words with more than one L sound. Based on Hurlbut's testimony and other information, documentation, passwords always included the letter L in particular, because Japanese people would have a hard time pronouncing it right. When a guard challenged a person who was coming up behind them with if the password had any L sounds in it, a native English speaker would say it correctly and automatically. An Asian speaker, even one who speaks English well, would usually replace sounds that are more like Japanese liquid, something that, to the trained ear of the century, sounded very wrong. One certain word has made its way into it is a record of history, but it only comes from one source. John Oliver Garling. There was an article in the Associated Press in 1942 called Free Men Are Fighting, the story of World War II with Farah. On page 315 of his book, Garling wrote that Japanese. He said that soldiers would sometimes go up to checkpoints pretending to be American or Filipino soldiers. That guards would use a shibboleth like Lollipop, and if the first two words come back as roars, and the guard would fire without waiting to hear the rest. If it was really Lollipop, it would be a great word for this purpose. Used. An American slang word for something really cool or unique. It starts each syllable with 4 L sounds quickly one after the other. Lollipop. Each of these L sounds would be hard for a Japanese speaker to make, making it almost impossible to say the word correctly without a lot of practice. The advice to pay close attention to the first 2 syllables. It also makes tactical sense. A guard wouldn't have to wait for the whole password to figure out if it was pronounced wrong, cutting down on exposure time during the challenge. But we need to be clear. It's known that Garling's book is the only source for Lollipop. In particular, the book came out in 1942, making it current with the events, and Garling was a reliable reporter who could talk to military sources. But there were no independent official Marine Corps after-action reports, operational histories, or other memoirs from the time back up this story. Participants. Richard Trigaskis's Guadalcanal Diary, which came out in 1943 and is based on his time there. As a reporter covering the war on the island, doesn't say the exact word. Helmet for My Pillow, Robert Leckie's autobiography, and other first-person accounts don't talk about it either. Can say for sure is that L-based passwords were used as. Bert's direct testimony proved it. Whether La Palua was one of those passwords is still a possibility, but it hasn't been proven for sure. The phrase, fits the tactical requirements, shows up in a contemporary source and fits with what has been documented, but more proof would make the accusation stronger. Say what you want. The campaign lasted from August 7, 1942, to February 9, 1943, when Japanese forces successfully got the last of their troops off the island in the morning. Japanese attempts to retake the area put constant pressure on the Marines and later on the Army forces that came to help them. Airfield. The Battle of the Tinaroo on August 21 was one of the most important battles. The Battle of Edson's Ridge took place from September 12 to 14, and the Battle for Henderson Field took place from October 23 to 26. During these battles, and the times in between, the area around the American border remained safe. Japanese methods for infiltration were well known. Japanese soldiers. They would try to get through the American lines at night, often working alone or in small groups. They are very good at hiding their identities, and they often add jungle plants to their uniforms. They moved very quietly through areas they had well researched. Some of them spoke English, and Japanese soldiers were seen trying to pass themselves off as American soldiers. The threat was real and persistent. In his interview, Bert also talked about an interesting extra security sign. On at least one. On one occasion, a sentry caught Japanese spies because they used grammar that was way too precise for the. One of the infiltrators is said to have said, "Hold your fire. We're American Marines and want to report what we did this evening," which made the sentry fire right away because I was me. I knew that no Marine would talk that way. It gave a reliable way to find infiltrators that didn't depend on visual confirmation, paperwork, or even a long conversation. A simple problem with an L-ound word could quickly find and reveal an intruder. The test worked exactly as planned. Use something that was hard for the intruder to fake, the automatic pronunciation patterns that were set up. During the time when children are learning language, the word shibboleth comes from the Gileadites knew who their enemy was in Judges 12 verses 5 to 6 of the Hebrew Bible. The Ephraimites, because they couldn't say the word correctly, they said cyth instead of the esh sound, which showed what tribe they were from. Similar linguistic tests have. Language barriers have been used in the military for a long time to tell the difference between friend and foe. The invasion of Normandy on D-Day, June 6, 1944, was a good marker. Used a different language rule to achieve the same goal. The challenge and password system used flash as the question, thunder as the password, and welcome as the answer. This group of words was picked because they had sounds that German speakers had trouble with. There is no voiceless dental fricative thief sound in thunder in German, and standard also does not have the voiced labial VA approximate W sound that is in the word welcome. This similar use of linguistic shibboleths in the European theater is called German phonology. Demonstrates that the military knew how to use phological differences to keep people safe. Other aspects of English pronunciation that Japanese speakers found hard added the English V sound, which isn't there in Japanese and is usually said as B. The TH sound has both a voiced and a voiceless sound, and the English. Japanese only has 5 vowels, but this language has many more distinct vowel sounds. Any of these differences could be used to break security-conscious passwords, but the L/R difference seems to be the most likely one. From what we know so far, these have been the most common ones used. The bigger picture of security measures in the Pacific theater adds to the picture. American forces all over the Pacific faced constant problems with spying, lying, and not being able to tell the difference between friend and foe. Foe in situations where it was often impossible to see them. The challenge and password system they used by military forces around the world became even more important in the Pacific because several things about that theater make it special. First, the jungle setting of most. Visibility was very poor on the battlefields in the Pacific because of thick vegetation, heavy rain, and the fact that Japanese forces often operated at night meant that sentries often had to make identification. Second, Japanese tactical doctrine says that decisions should only be based on sound and speech, focused on operations that happened at night, infiltration, and attacks that were meant to cause as much chaos and confusion as possible. The challenge and password system has been used by the military for a long time. The process is easy. A sentry issues a challenge, which is usually just one word. The person being asked for a password must give it. If the password is wrong or not given, the sentry does the right thing. How well this system works depends on a number of things, including the challenge, and to keep them from being hacked, passwords need to be changed often and given to all friendly forces, being kept from the enemy, and they should be picked in a way that makes it hard for enemy forces to say them correctly. The Military Intelligence Service Language School is an interesting contrast to the way the words are pronounced. Test story. Started on November 1st, 1941, at the since MSU had to move from the Presidio of San Francisco to Camp Savage, Minnesota, in June 1942, after Executive Order 966, which put Japanese people in camps, Americans from the West Coast. In August 1944, the school moved to Fort Snelling, Minnesota. Ran until June 1946, and over 6,000 Japanese were trained to use missiles. During the war, these people worked with American soldiers as translators, interpreters, and intelligence analysts. A second generation of Japanese Americans served all over the Pacific Theater, helping with language issues that were very important. Querying, translating documents, and spying are some of the things that are done. These Japanese-American linguists were very important to the success of the Allies in the Pacific. Questioned prisoners, translated documents that were taken, listened in on and translated radio calls, and their service was especially important because it helped commanders understand how Japanese soldiers thought about culture. It's important to note that many of their families were locked up in camps while they fought for the United States. These Japanese-American soldiers would have passed any L-based pronunciation test. Question automatically. They spoke English with native pronunciation, having learned it during, as children in American communities. Their service in the Pacific Theater, very useful for gathering information. It also meant that security forces had to know that Japanese ethnicity did not automatically show that you are an enemy. Private First Class Eugene B. Sledge gives one of the few verified first-person accounts from a person who served in the Pacific Theater and later. Sledge wrote about his experiences. He joined the Marines and served with K Company, 3rd Battalion. He was in the 5th Marines, 1st Marine Division, and fought in the battles of Peleliu and Okinawa, where they fought some of the fiercest battles of the Pacific War. When it came out in 1981, his book about his time with the old breed at Peleliu and Okinawa became. It is thought to be one of the best first-person accounts of infantry combat. Sledge did not work at Guadalcanal during the campaign, but he did go there in 1944 to train after the fighting was over. But his book doesn't talk about pronunciation tests specifically. It instead talks about the realities of combat, the mental toll of long-term fighting, and what Marine infantrymen went through in the Pacific. The fact that most combat memoirs don't talk much about pronunciation tests is, we would have expected more if the practice was as organized and detailed as some popular accounts say it was. A lot of times in the dozens of memoirs written by veterans, the lack of noise suggests that while Hellblut confirms that LBA's passwords were used, but the use may not have been as common or widespread as it is now. Accounts implied that security measures that work well are often taken for granted by those who use them every day. The final victory for the Allies came at a high cost. About 7,100 American soldiers were killed and over 8,000 were hurt, and the number of Japanese deaths was much higher, with estimates of about 31,000 people were killed, many of them from sickness and hunger, as American naval. Japanese supply efforts were stopped by land, sea, and air forces. In February 1943, an evacuation saved about 10,000 Japanese troops who were sent to other places later, but it was clear that Japan had lost the war on a strategic level. We lost the Pacific and will never get it back. The problems with pronunciation tests should also be. Herbert pointed out that it didn't always work with English-educated Japanese. Any Japanese person who had grown up in an English-speaking home would have learned how to pronounce words like a native speaker and could pass L-based tests. Intelligence services knew about this benefit and sometimes hired people with English backgrounds for. In the chaos of battle, with artillery fire, explosions, and other noises, intelligence operations. When people are shouting, it might be hard to pick up on small differences in pronunciation. There was also a chance that the test would give false positives. American forces in the Pacific included soldiers from different backgrounds, such as Filipino soldiers and scouts, Chinese Americans, and other people whose English may not be pronounced or accented in the normal way. There were legitimate differences in how English was spoken among Allied forces, so security procedures had to take those into account. Phonological differences between Filipino and Japanese meant that Filipinos who spoke English usually. I had no trouble with the eel and ear sounds because they are used in Tagalog and other Philippine languages. There are some ways, though, in which their English might sound different from American English. Based on L sounds, pronunciation testing was a beautiful way to solve a real security problem. Real psychological differences didn't need any special tools, could be used quickly, and gave a good reason for identification when other methods weren't available or weren't going to work. The test worked because it looked at something basic about how people learn languages, the fact that phonological patterns set up in early childhood tend to stay pretty stable throughout life and are hard to change, even with a lot of practice and conscious effort. The history of pronunciation tests serves many purposes. Uses today, for historians, it gives them a look into the practicalities of security operations during the Pacific War. For linguists, it shows how phonological knowledge can be used in the real world. For viewers, it's an interesting example of how language can be used as a weapon in war. But maybe, most importantly, it reminds us to be wary of historical claims and tell the difference between facts that have been well documented and later additions. The main part of the story that has been proven to be true is clear and interesting. Guadalcanal used passwords with L sounds to help find Japanese spies who would have been hard to catch. Pronounce those sounds correctly. Participants wrote down that they did this. Makes a lot of sense, given that Japanese and English sound different and are used in different situations. There needs to be innovation when there are real security problems. Lulu shows up in one modern source and fits the pattern perfectly. Even though independent confirmation would make the claim stronger, this core of verified accounts is just the tip of the iceberg. Have added details that can't be confirmed and made up numbers that don't show up in historical records. And linking the behavior to a centralized program that runs across the Pacific that doesn't have any records. While embellishments make for more interesting stories, they change the facts of history and make up false ones. Thoughts on the type and amount of pronunciation tests. The truthful history based only on confirmed. It's enough that the evidence is impressive on its own. It shows that American forces, getting used to the difficulties of jungle warfare, using differences in language to make things safer, and coming up with new ideas at the tactical level to deal with immediate threats. This shows how valuable observation, practical intelligence, and a willingness to try new things are also important. It gives us a look into what combat operations are really like in the Pacific theater, where safety. American forces had to deal with identification problems and the constant threat of infiltration. Marines who created and used pronunciation tests should be praised for their useful work. While the campaign as a whole reminds us of the terrible toll war takes on people and how complicated, the Japanese Americans who worked as linguists in the Pacific often did so while there. Families who stayed in internment camps showed loyalty and professionalism. In very tough conditions, they made a huge difference in the victory, and their story is important. It helps us understand the Pacific War better by giving it more depth and flavor. A record shows that American Marines at Guadalcanal regularly used passwords with L sounds to help find Japanese people who were sneaking in. This practice was directly supported by combat correspondent James Howell, but used real differences in the way words sound in Japanese and English. Lollipop is used as an example of one of these passwords in a reliable source from 1942. While claims of widespread testing in the Pacific cannot be confirmed, the use at Guadalcanal has been proven. Shows creative and useful tactical solutions that were used to solve real security problems. At Guadalcanal, such as security measures like tests of pronunciation, American operations for the rest of the Pacific War were based on this information. Each new campaign saw improvements in strategies, planning, and coordinating operations. the assaults by boats that followed. From Okinawa to the Marianas, the Philippines, and Tarawa, the basis of what they learned at Guadalcanal. While we can't prove it, as with the Guadalcanal battle, pronunciation tests were done at these later battles with the same level of certainty. It was still okay to use language differences for security reasons. The scientific knowledge of phonology and language learning that led to the creation of pronunciation tests. Work came later, after research was done before and after the war. There was no need for the Marines at Guadalcanal to understand the theory of language to know that Japanese speakers had having trouble with English L sounds, and that this could be used to find people who are sneaking in. This is the best kind of useful knowledge, observations based on experience that can be used to solve problems right away. What this wartime use means for society in general. It goes beyond military history to acknowledge that language features can serve as reliable identifiers has changed how security is handled in conflicts that followed. During the Vietnam War, American forces used similar ideas, but they changed them to fit the different languages that were spoken. More recent conflicts, linguistic analysis has become more complex by adding voice to it. Technologies for stress analysis and dialect identification that go far beyond simple pronunciation. Testing. The moral aspects of testing pronunciation should also be thought about. When compared to other security measures that relied on lies or hurt people, pronunciation testing was basically diagnostic. It found out linguistic background without. Soldiers who passed the test didn't suffer any harm other than the security consequences of failing the ID test. Bad effects. Those who failed were flagged as possible infiltrators, not because they were unfairly treated, but because objective phonetic evidence showed they didn't have the language skills. They said about the background. This relatively harmless nature of the tests compared to. It was still legal under the laws of war to use more violent or coercive security measures. The Geneva Conventions. The test also brings to light a key idea about identity and race. Japanese Americans who were serving in the Pacific, like those in the military intelligence service, they automatically passed pronunciation tests because their language was. This showed that pronunciation is American, no matter what race they are. When people took the tests, they were mostly asked about their language skills, not their race or ethnicity. It was the link between Japanese citizenship and Japanese language background, not race itself, that led to the tests. Effective for finding enemy infiltrators. This difference, while maybe not fully articulated during the war, which raised important questions about how language works with other things. Identity and safety. The Guadalcanal campaign has a human side that goes beyond tactics and rules for safety. The men who fought there, both American and Japanese. In one of the hardest campaigns of the war, they showed courage, determination, and the ability to change. The Americans who created and used pronunciation tests should be praised for their useful work. New ideas. The Japanese soldiers who had to deal with these measures were skilled and determined fighters, working in very tough conditions, fighting thousands of miles away from home with fewer and fewer reliable supplies. Supply lines. The study of phonetic phenomena that made pronunciation possible after the war. Effective testing has helped us learn more about how people learn and use language. Linguists and a lot of research was done on by cognitive scientists, many of whom had worked in military intelligence during the war. Linguists like Patricia Cole have studied how to learn how to pronounce a second language, and others showed that babies can tell the difference between phonetic contrasts from the time they are born, that everyone can understand language, but that this ability becomes less general in the first year of life as the brain focuses on the phonetic categories of the native language. This neural commitment to native phonetic categories, necessary for efficient language processing, makes the same kinds of restrictions that made pronunciation difficult. Testing worked well during the war. Japanese adults trying to learn. The English L and R sounds weren't just learning new ways to be articulated. They were also trying to change the way our brains work. Perceptual categories that had been set up decades before, which cognitive science has since shown to be. The pronunciation is very hard and often impossible to finish fully. Language research into the idea of a foreign accent was also affected by tests used during World War II. During the war, people often thought that accented speech was just bad pronunciation that could be fixed with practice. After the war, research showed that a foreign accent can reveal deep structural. This knowledge led to differences in how sounds are processed, not just mistakes. Improvements in the way languages are taught and the understanding that adult language learners, despite no matter how hard they try, will almost always keep some accent features from their native language. This meant that pronunciation tests would still be a good way to identify people in the future for military security. During conflicts, the fact that different forces speak different languages could be used to keep everyone safe. In later wars, the principle has been used in different ways. However, modern technology has made tools more useful. Voice stress analysis and linguistic profiling, which are more than just tests of pronunciation. This is the case of Technical Sergeant Paul Yamamoto, whose name we can't find in historical records, but who stands for the thousands of Japanese Americans who did serve and shows how complicated pronunciation can be. Tests in a war where Japanese Americans served in the American forces, even though they were being held in camps. This group of Nisei soldiers who had grown up speaking English showed through their native pronunciation that linguistic identity could go beyond race. On the other hand, Japanese soldiers who, when they tried to sneak in, their non-native pronunciation showed that linguistic identity had not been established, not by race, but by how much they heard a language as a child. Many people thought that this would be the last and bloodiest part of the Pacific War, so they got ready for it. If the U.S. had invaded the Japanese home islands, American soldiers would have been in a place where the enemy could easily get in. Japanese forces would be even harder to find than on Pacific Islands, would have unlimited access to local resources, civilian clothes, and the chance to get help from civilians. Population. In this setting, accurate identification methods would have been absolutely essential. Plans were made for comprehensive security protocols that would have pronunciation tests with strict rules on what you can and can't say, lots of paperwork needed, physical identification needed, and movement zones. The rules assumed that even with tests of pronunciation, some Japanese people who were exposed to English as a child or who have great language skills might try to infiltrate. Multiple layers of security would provide extra checks that would catch even the most complex attempts to break in. However, these plans were never fully carried out because Japan gave up after the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But they were the conclusion of years of work to improve language safety measures. After the war, a lot of documents about security procedures in the Pacific were made public. When these documents came out in the following decades, they gave us fascinating new information about many parts of Pacific. Historians found a lot of information about how the plan was made, how it was used, and how well different security measures worked, but specific proof of pronunciation tests was still missing, limited mostly to Hurlbut's testimony and the reference to Gramling. The story reminds us that success depends on a huge number of small ideas that were created by people who were having trouble right then and there. Solutions. The fact that people realized that differences in language could be used to identify people showed. Using L-based passwords in a planned way gives you practical intelligence and tactical flexibility. At Guadalcanal, even if it wasn't as complicated as some popular stories say, was a real step forward. That solved a real security problem. Today, we'll talk about the pronunciation tests at Guadalcanal. In the bigger story of the Pacific War, this small but important chapter shows how language, one of the most human traits, can be used as a weapon in war. This shows how understanding language differences can be useful for strategy, and this shows that winning wars is possible. Often happens when big strategic decisions are put together with a lot of small tactical improvements made by soldiers who were having immediate problems. When the historical record was looked at carefully and honestly shows what pronunciation testing can and can't do as a security measure. It worked at Guadalcanal and gave people for hundreds of years a quick and accurate way to find out where things were. Given the realities of Japanese and English as languages, it made perfect sense. English sound systems, but it wasn't a perfect system and it wasn't a program that covered the whole Pacific. Not the complicated scheme that some popular accounts have said. By understanding what the evidence actually shows, and we're clear about how weak that evidence is, we remember those who fought in the Pacific while keeping the intellectual honesty that good history calls for. The Marines at Guadalcanal faced. In one of the first major American offensive operations of the Pacific War, they had to deal with a lot of difficult situations. Innovation in making useful security measures like testing your pronunciation, along with their guts in The fighting and their determination to hold Henderson Field against repeated Japanese attacks led to a strategic victory that changed the course of the Pacific War. The story's core has been proven to be true. American forces took advantage of fundamental differences in how Japanese and English speakers make and hear liquid consonant sounds to make a security measure that was easy to use, worked well, and was hard to get around. Counterfeit. This use of linguistic knowledge, whether it comes from this kind of tactical innovation, which could come from conscious understanding or practical observation, aided the Allies in their victory in the Pacific.